I don't know about you, but during this Christmas season, I am taking in all the Christmas movies. I think we talked about Home Alone last week. And what I've noticed is that not all Christmas movies are the same. Some of them are more lighthearted. Many of them are filled with comedy, like the National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation film. I think some of you are starting to dress up like those folks for your Christmas parties, some of those characters from those films. But one that has lingered and has endured season after season, Christmas after Christmas, is A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. It was actually written as a novella in the middle of the 1800s. And for whatever reason, that story gets told again and again and has a different shape and a different mood than the other stories out there. I think many of us are familiar with the story of Ebenezer Scrooge and the different ghosts that visit him to try to provide an intervention for him in the midst of his isolation and of the ways in which he was not warm and welcoming towards his neighbors around him. The governing question of that novella, of that story, is Christmas powerful enough to awaken the cold heart of old Ebenezer Scrooge? And so there's this different intervention from, once again, these different ghosts of ghosts of Christmas past, present, and future. And there's a delicate, that transformation to Ebenezer was brokered by a delicate balance of grace and truth. There's truth in that story because Ebenezer needed to hear the truth. And so, again, he's given what Doug Otati, a Protestant theologian, calls the right type of nightmares. His eyes are opened about the things that he was doing and the ramifications of his choices in his community. But it wasn't just truth that was conveyed to Ebenezer Scrooge, but also grace. Because after his journey from past, present, and future, he was able to go back into the present, and he had an opportunity to make new choices, fresh and new. That was the grace that was extended to him. Maybe that's a lesson that we teach, that it teaches us, is that there's a delicate balance for all of our transformation. Any change that happens in our life and the world around us, there's a balance of grace and truth. But if we were honest, a lot of times we don't see that balance in our human relationships, do we? Even as individual people, we are probably prone to one or the other. There are some of us who are prone to grace because we don't want to offend people. So when it comes to those moments when we need to maybe speak the truth to somebody, to tell them our perspective and our experience with them, maybe they've hurt our feelings, we don't want to say anything harsh to them because mama told us if you don't say something nice, don't say anything at all. And so we kind of wander through life gracious, but we lack those moments where we get to speak truth. The danger of that is that in excess, that could actually enable bad patterns of behavior and actually hurt people's lives around us. Now, some of us are more prone to truth rather than grace. We like to tell it as it is. We've got a speech for everybody, and we can't wait for the appropriate time to level them with all of the fine bullet points that we think about them, about this current issue, about the way in which they put their toilet paper on the wall, how they park in their driveways, their Christmas decorations. Am I hitting a nerve yet this morning? We can't wait. Or maybe you're married to someone like that. Maybe you have a sibling like that. Maybe you're dating someone like that, who they just cannot wait to speak the truth. What we see is there's an opportunity for us to bridge grace and truth together. For those of us who want to be overly kind to one another, that's fine. I think it's nice to have a kind and soft disposition, but there come key and critical moments where it's important and loving to speak the truth to one another. For those who are only truth tellers, we need to be warned this morning that to only speak truth and not to stick around and to continue to have a relationship with that person is no way to have a friendship. It's no way to have a marriage. It's no way to have a relationship with the wider world around us. I once heard that Winston Churchill was at a party, and he had too much to drink one night, and a woman came up to him. She wanted to speak the truth to him, and she said, "Mr. Churchill, I believe that you are drunk." And Churchill said, "Well, woman, you are ugly." And he said, "And the truth is, I'll be sober tomorrow, but you're still going to be ugly tomorrow morning." Okay? That doesn't seem to be the way to go about life. But nevertheless, we have this dilemma in our hands. How can we have both grace and truth? What we see in the life of Christ, that Jesus had a balance of both of them. He excelled in both of them. We read in John chapter 1, verse 14, that the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. God dwelled among us. There was a carving out of his existence among us in the life of Jesus. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father. And notice the last line of this well-known verse, full of grace and truth. Jesus was full grace and he was full truth. It wasn't like he majored in grace and minored in truth. It wasn't like his full-time job was truth and he had a side hustle of grace. In one person, the face of Jesus Christ, the guy that we find in the face of Jesus Christ, there's full grace and there's full truth. But what does this mean? I think we have a picture of what that means, but what is John getting at when he's trying to convey that as we meet Jesus early in his story, that Jesus is full grace and full truth? How does that play out for the rest of this story? Well, it's interesting. John, out of all the rest of the gospel writers of the New Testament, mentions truth more often than the rest. Upwards of 20 some odd times he speaks of truth. You look at the letters of John in the New Testament, once again, truth is repeated there again and again. He doesn't mention grace as often, but truth seems to be one of the governing ideas in the way that he wants to convey who Jesus is. Now, when we think of truth, and this was the same in the original language in the New Testament, truth is simply facts versus the fiction, right? When you ask someone to tell the truth, you're hoping that they will tell you what has happened, and they won't try to spin the details and whisper half-truths or fiction. But as the biblical scholars have tried to grapple with John's letter, or John's gospel, we find that there's even a deeper meaning than that. Going back to the original Hebrew of the Old Testament, truth is not just facts versus fiction. It's actually something more than that. It's actually this idea of faithfulness. You ever been in a moment where you're in a relationship with somebody, and after a while they show their true colors? It's almost like they've been putting on a facade at some level as you're getting used to one another, and their true colors finally emerge at some point. This is what the image is in the original language. And so this is what John is saying. If you want to get a picture of who God is in his true colors, faithfulness looks like the meeting together of truth and grace. But there's still 1,000 questions even after that explanation, right? We see this happen a few times in the gospel text. It's worth noting. The first one's in John chapter 3. Jesus is encountered by a man named Nicodemus. When we first meet him in John 3, he is called a Pharisee. That's just a first century term for someone who was a biblical enthusiast. He was at church all the time. When the doors were open, he was there. He was probably a Bible teacher. He probably had the scripture memorized. He probably had different teachings from area rabbis memorized. This guy was informed about his faith. But it's interesting that even though he was informed about his faith, even though if he was on your Bible trivia team, he would anchor that team, he comes to Jesus with questions. And John says that he comes in the middle of the night, and there's a couple reasons that he would mention that, but perhaps he doesn't want anyone else to know. He's like sneaking around, wanting to ask Jesus some questions, and he is vexed with tons of questions. And Jesus begins to interact with him. He tries to interact with him. He tries to reason with him, but this Nicodemus continues to press Jesus further, and so Jesus gives him a metaphor to lead him on the next phase of his spiritual journey. He says, Nicodemus, you must be born again. To which Nicodemus says, how is that physiologically possible that I could be born again? But in shorthand, this is what Jesus is saying. You know, you've got all your facts and figures figured out. You've got all the footnotes memorized. But you've been in control of your own faith. It's time for you to have an experience of faith that is outside of your control or your own rationality. It includes all that you know about God, but it also exceeds it at the same time. Isn't that interesting that Jesus would use this metaphor? I mean, being born is an experience that all of us have had, but we had nothing to do with it. It happened to us. So this is what Jesus is saying. You need to slip into the next spiritual phase of your journey, of your spiritual journey, which is you need to put your life into the hands of a loving God and not try to earn your way deeper and deeper in your walk of faith. You need to allow something to happen to you instead of trying to micromanage it yourself. It reminds me of a story of an author. His name is Timothy Paul Jones, and he adopted a daughter for his family from the foster system. And when she was in the foster care system, she was with the family, and all she ever wanted to do was go to Disney World because she's just a normal kid. She wants to go to Disney World. And so her foster family said that if she behaved better, if she had a better attitude, or if she did her chores, or if she had better grades, then they would allow her to go to Disney World. But she never did. So when she was adopted by Jones's family, they took her. One of the first things that they did is they took her to Disney World, and she said in the middle of all the bliss of experiencing all the castles and all the princesses and all the rides, she says, Daddy, I know that I'm not here at Disney World because of something that I've done or because I'm good. I'm here because I'm yours and I'm in your family. That's something that seemed that Nicodemus was missing. It's something that critical for you and I in our Christian faith. It's not because of anything good that we have done that we're in God's family. No, we have been invited into his family because something is happening to us outside of our control, and it wasn't our idea. God is pursuing us, and he wants to bring us into his family. That's grace, but it leads us into deeper and deeper levels of truth. We see grace and truth in another critical time in John's Gospel, in John chapter 8. This is the bracketed off story in John's Gospel. If you have a good study Bible, there's a chance that this is bracketed off. It's in italics, and there's some explanation of why it is. But I think many of us know the story. It's a familiar story. Jesus has just experienced a festival with his friends. He's in a crowded part of Jerusalem. He's teaching them, and all of a sudden, in the middle of his lecture, a woman who's been caught in adultery is brought to him. And the men who brought her to him want to try to trap Jesus. They give him a nearly impossible snare to try to navigate in this very critical part of his story. They say, Jesus, according to our law, she should be stoned to death because she's been caught in adultery. What do you suppose we should do? Jesus has a really hard decision to make here. Should he apply the law of Moses and allow this person who doesn't know, he doesn't know all the circumstances, he doesn't know the backstory, he doesn't know even if this is true or not, but does he allow the law of Moses to be applied to this woman, or does he say, no, this doesn't apply here, and put himself into public scrutiny? So he does something different. He decides to find a third way forward. He doesn't exempt the fact that Moses had talked about stoning as a capital offense for this sin of adultery, but he asks them, if any of you are without sin, you can cast the first stone. Jesus is creating an alternate universe at this moment. None of the men who walked to find Jesus that day considered this was going to be their option or their way forward. They thought either we're going to take Jesus to be arrested if he doesn't follow our way, or this woman's going to be stoned to death. Instead, John tells us that they begin to drop their stones from the oldest to the youngest, and they all wander away. Imagine their conversation on the way home. Like there's a strange power at work in that moment. I didn't expect things to go that way. But a better truth, a gracious truth was spoken in that moment. And as all the men began to file away, and it was just Jesus and the woman caught in adultery, he calls her daughter, he affirms her, but then he also challenges her, we see in John chapter 8, verse 11. He says, go and sin no more. That's grace and that's truth meeting together in the ministry of Jesus. Jesus tried to ascribe more value to both the woman who was caught in adultery and to the people carrying stones that day. You are more than this one offense against God, and God didn't create a law so that we can throw stones at one another. That's not the primary use of this law, but there is a better way. And so Jesus found a way for grace and for truth to get the last word. Frederick Buechner says this idea of God ascribing more worth to us, where grace and truth meet. Frederick Buechner says the grace of God means something like this. Here is your life. You might never have been, but you are, because the party wouldn't be complete without you. Here is the world. Beautiful and terrible things will happen. Don't be afraid. I am with you. Nothing can ever separate us. It is for you I created the universe. I love you. What happens when grace and truth meet together in that faithfulness is that God allows us to know that we are loved by him, and that even though the world around us is very complicated, that he is with us and never leave us or forsake us, and we can journey forward, particularly in complex moments like what he found in John chapter 8. Let's just be honest, though. To be a person of grace and truth is really challenging, isn't it? I mean, right now, some of us are saying, no, I'm a truth person. Don't give me this wimpy, weak grace thing. I'll let somebody else do that. I'll run somebody over, and my spouse, who is more in the grace thing, she can come pick them up, right? Some of us are not willing to suggest that we could do this for ourselves. And perhaps the reason that we are reluctant to do so is because we would rather have our own way. We would rather have it cut and dry, black and white. No, I'll be truthful. I can say the hard things, and then I can whisk myself away, and somebody else can pick them up and blow their nose for them and help nurse them back to health. Or if we're like a grace person, we say, you know what, I'm just going to love them in a way over a long period of time. No truth words have to be spoken. At some point, they're going to get their own point, and they're going to be able to get the truth in their own way, and there's no way they need to hear the hard truth from me. I think the reason that we have a difficulty is because this is outside of our comfort zone. This is something we're not used to. But if we're going to be followers of Jesus, who is full of grace and truth, we need to be full of grace and truth as well. What I've found to be a person who's full of grace and truth is that we have to learn to lose sometimes, that we can't have it our way, that we do have to say the very stern and pointed word in an anxious moment, that we do have to give more patience and nuance than the black and white world that we try to carve out for the world around us. And we see this when Jesus is before Pilate and he's in his trial before Pilate. And there's this accusation that Jesus has made himself the king of the Jews, which is an offense against Rome. And so as Jesus and Pilate are speaking together, Jesus begins to talk about truth once more, about the faithfulness of God, about Jesus' own faithfulness to his calling. And Pilate says, "What is truth?" But he doesn't stick around to want to hear the answer. But the reason we already know the answer is because early in the gospel, we hear this stunning truth in John 14, verse 6, where Jesus says, "I am the way, I am the truth, I am the life." In the Christian worldview, truth is not merely propositional statements. Truth is a person. And it's the person that we find uniquely in Jesus Christ. And how he handles truth is something for us to take notice of. Notice that he is on trial, that he's in a place of weakness. This seems to be the message of the gospel. If you and I want to be full of grace and truth, if we want to be truth tellers in the world, then we need to be able to bear the burden of the world as we tell its truth. I think sometimes we like to tell the truth from ivory towers or from the anonymity of a keyboard, instead of speaking the truth and then hanging around with all the mess that telling the truth creates. What we see in the gospel is that to be a truth teller is to hang in with the problems of the world, to know that they're more complicated than we could have imagined, and to be patient with the outworking of that transformative work of grace and truth being met together. I saw a picture of this in the film The Interpreter. I don't know if you've seen The Interpreter. It came out a long, long time ago. But Nicole Kidman's character was an interpreter for the the United Nations, the UN, and she's from continental Africa, and she tells us an interesting story of an interesting practice of an ancient tribe in Africa called the Ku tribe. Whenever someone's life is taken in that community, they have a peculiar practice. What they do is they hold the person who did the crime in containment for a whole year, and on the eve of the anniversary of the murder, they have a big party together and they tell their civilization story once again. They share fellowship with one another. But early the next day, on the anniversary of the murder, they take the accused, they bind him hand and foot, they put him in a boat in the middle of the river nearby, and the rest of their community lines the river, and they turn the boat over, and the one accused of murder is plunged into the river. The only person who can jump in and rescue the person in the water is the family of the one whose loved one was killed. They have a decision to make in that hard moment. They can allow him to drown because that would be justice, a life for life. No one would bat their eye at that. But there's a hidden challenge behind justice like that, because a family just like theirs is going to lose a child just like them. And so they're actually giving the pain that they've been experiencing over the year to another family. And who knows? There might be animosity, there might be envy, there might be rivalry, there might be hatred expressed towards family to family for the generations to come. But if they decide to wade into the waters, that it's wiser to save a life than to allow one to go. Even though they absorb the penalty themselves, they bring a life back, and it actually might have a chance to heal their civilization around them. That's what it looks like to walk in grace and truth at times. Is to take a knee and not to have our way. To be willing to lose. To be willing to be more patient than we thought we'd ever imagine we could be in a very challenging moment. To not raise our voice. To not gossip behind their back. To not bring it up to a supervisor because we know that they could get the harsh penalty against them, but to give time for grace and for truth to mingle together towards this long arc of transformation. As we think about what it means to be a Christian and a Christian community in a world like ours, perhaps we can meditate on what it means to have grace and truth a bit further, because right now we're having a war over truth in our culture. It was the word of the year a few years back, post-truth or alternative facts. If you heard the news from this channel, it's not right because this channel has all the facts. And so we have all this war on words. We scream past one another, and there never seems to be a synthesis or a meeting or settling or reason together in the middle. Perhaps the Church of Jesus Christ can pave a better way of grace and truth. Let me read you a quotation from Peter Weiner, who is the senior fellow at the Ethics of Public Policy Center on Capitol Hill. He has served the past 3 Republican administrations about matters of how ethics, Christian faith, culture, and politics overlap with one another in our culture. He's been serving political parties, particularly the Republican Party, for the last 3 decades. But he's concerned about how the church has postured themselves in this anxious moment. Instead of being known for grace and truth, there is something that's animating us collectively that's causing us not to get along with the watching world around us. So in his closing comments of an article that he wrote recently, he says this: "If I could impart a different way of approaching politics and shaping culture to my co-religionists, it would be to realize that a commitment to moral truth need not be at odds with being instruments of healing and grace. We need to find ways to love others in unexpected ways and show what it means to live faithfully in a world full of fear," as Mark Labradon, president of Fuller Theological Seminary, puts it. We should be willing to accept good news wherever we find it. We shouldn't assume that joy, gratitude, and kindness are synonyms for weakness. And we should be known for caring for our culture, more for caring for our culture than constantly being at war with it. And this is what he says, once again, as a Christian. Jesus didn't view the world primarily as a battle zone. Neither should we. And maybe Christmas can convince us of this truth. Because instead of arriving among us, the one full of grace and truth, like a warlord armed to the teeth, Jesus came as a vulnerable, innocent baby boy. Maybe that should be the posture of the church, full of vulnerability, full of humility, full of grace, and full of truth.